I Hello everyone. Tung përshëndetje. I hope everyone is having a good weekend. Thank you so much for spending this part of your Sunday with us. Uh, my name is Hana Marku. I'm one part of this amazing organizing team that has been working hard to put this event together and to bring this conversation to our community. Um, I think we'll get started with very brief introductions and we'll get straight into Alicia's presentation. Um, Merita, who you see up on your screen, Merita and I are the founders of this little initiative called Albanians Active Now, and we had been thinking about ways to have conversations about issues like racial justice in our community, and we didn't really know how to begin that. This conversation was born out of us connecting with Alicia. And Alicia, as I think everyone in the call probably knows, is an academic and also an activist. And she's very familiar with our community, both in Albania and Kosovo and also in the diaspora. And we were so pleased that she agreed to be the teacher and the facilitator for this event. Irina and Nora joined the organizing team shortly afterwards, and the Harvard Albanian Student Association reached out to us, and we decided that we would collaborate together to co-host this event. The Harvard Albanian Student Association has done a lot of heavy lifting to put this event together. And I mean, the reason for putting together an event like this is because we have a stake in racial justice as a community. We have a responsibility, because of our recent past, to stand in solidarity with our friends from other communities who are being the unfair targets of white supremacy. That is a very brief overview of how this event came together. I do want to give Drin Krasniqi from the Harvard Albanian Student Association to give a chance to address us all here today. And then we're going to go through some more, very briefly, a few administrative things, and then we're going to get straight into Alicia's presentation. Drin?
Hi, everybody. Thank you all for joining us today. It is our honor to be able to have this event, which we have been working on for the past 3 weeks. I am the co-president of the Harvard Albanian Student Association, and this was actually another co-president's, Artea's, idea. She reached out to Albanians Active Now because we know how important this is to our community, especially as Albanians, and we hope that you will enjoy this talk, especially given Alicia's extensive experience on the topic.
Great. So my name is Mivita, and I just quickly wanted to provide a little information. We were going to have interpretation, but it seems like no one that was able to join us today needed interpretation. If that is incorrect, shkruaj in the chat to do it. And if not, we will continue. We were having some technical issues, but we're going to work on those for the second and third session as well. So, all right, so you'll see this banner at the top of every slide. So if while we're having a conversation, while you're hearing Alicia speak, you have questions, please submit them through that link. If that link is giving you difficulties, you can always use a chat if that's easier, especially if you're on a mobile device. But the nice thing about that link too is even if you don't have a question, go to that link, and I just put that in the chat, and you can upvote or downvote well, upvote would be the kinder thing to do. Other people's questions that you're also interested in hearing those answers to, so that we can get a sense of the highest demand questions. And that'll be a way for you to participate too, even if you don't have specific questions. I do believe you have to be logged into your Gmail account in order to be able to vote, but you can submit questions without being logged in. So anyways, this was going to be the instructions for interpretation, but we don't need it, so we can skip that.
Hi everyone, I'm Artea. I'm one of the co-presidents, along with Denny, along with Dren, sorry. And I just wanted to give a brief overview about what our organization is and kind of our mission statement. So the Harvard College Albanian Students Association is an organization that unites students of Albanian origin, but also anyone interested in Albanian culture, history, or contemporary issues. We hope to raise awareness to social, economic, and political conditions that affect Albanians throughout the world through community discussions, cultural events, forums, and networking events. And today we really want to kind of put in a sustained effort to help fellow students make a positive difference in this world. And just for short introduction, I'm a sophomore. I study social studies and ethnicity, migration, and rights. And I can make a mean Barakma spinach. And also say special thanks to our wonderful board, Francis, our vice president, and our treasurer, and Diana, our director of engagement and outreach, because they've helped a lot with our making our GoFundMe and also visual programming the beautiful poster that you guys saw.
All right, hello. I am here to introduce Albanians Active Now. Hannah covered it basically in the beginning in terms of what we are as an organization, but here's an overview of the four of us who are present here today. So Hannah Marku, yes, she's my sister, we are related, no more questions. And then we have Merita, who has just spoken a bit earlier about tech support, and she's a whiz with all that. So like props to you, Merita, for like actually being able to know technology. Irina is here as well. Irina runs the Albanian Archaeologist on Instagram, which I'm obsessed with, so you guys should definitely check that out. And myself, I'm the head of the Albanian Film Association in Toronto, Canada. And Artea, if you can make a good burek, like I will eat the good burek, because that could be my exclusive diet forever and ever. Amen. Let's like figure out some sort of shipment system. I don't know what, but it needs to. So yeah, that's us, and I won't make it any longer. Let me just mute myself here.
All right, so we also have our presenter, which I wanted to make sure you all had a really great full picture of her super impressive bio. So we're joined today, and you'll be hearing a lot from Alicia Strong, who is a Connecticut native from New Britain. She graduated from Wesleyan University with honors, earning a degree in political science and religious studies. The summer before starting at Wesleyan, she became interested in Islam in the Balkans after meeting a Muslim family who had come to the United States as refugees from Kosovo. The next summer, she participated in a study abroad program in Kosovo, and her sophomore year, she received the Mellon Mays undergraduate fellowship for her research proposal that sought to explore the Muslim identities of the Albanian population in Kosovo. During the spring of her junior year, she studied abroad again, splitting her time between Bosnia, Serbia, and Kosovo. And at the end of the semester, she conducted a month-long research project and published a paper entitled "The Patriarchy Knows No Bounds: The Intersection of Gender and Islam in Kosovo." Her paper focuses on debates among Kosovar-Albanians concerning their Muslim identity and how many of these debates were centered on women. She also wrote a thesis titled "Sorta Kinda Muslim: The Impact of Western Hegemony on Muslim Identity Negotiation." She speaks Arabic, Spanish, Albanian, and Serbo-Croatian. Currently, she focuses on race and racialization in the former Yugoslavia. Specifically, she focuses on the intersection of racialization and nationalism to understand the lived experiences of marginalized populations in former Yugoslav countries. Her current research project explores the socio-historical roots of the racialization of Roma, Ashkali, and Egyptian communities in Kosovo. So thank you so much for being with us and for sharing all your background with us today, Alicia. I think we're going to have a great Q&A, and I just wanted to plug one more time for folks to really participate through asking questions or voting for questions. And also, if you're on social media, especially social media that supports hashtags, we have a hashtag where you can be live tweeting or sharing your thoughts and learnings with the hashtag Solidariteti2020. So we would love to have engagement, even though this session in particular is more lecture than we're planning on having with our third sessions.
Hi, yeah, this is our last thing. A part of this series, we also wanted to engage in fundraising, kind of, you know, putting our money where our mouth is in terms of not only learning about how to be anti-racist and what that means, but actively being it. And one of the ways in which us as like the Harvard Albanian Students organization wanted to do this is by kind of matching fundings of up to $500 in donation, making our grand total, if you guys, you know, keep sending donations in, of $1,000. We have a lot of privilege as being a Harvard organization and as being Harvard students, and we wanted to use that in order to kind of fundraise for this very amazing cause. And we chose the National Black Justice Coalition specifically because it empowers Black, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. And oftentimes in Black liberation movements, we found that these voices are not kind of listened to or aren't brought up in the same way that we kind of focus these liberation movements on the straight, cis male. And thus we wanted to empower and lift up the voices, especially of women, queer folks, and transgender folks. So throughout this meeting, feel free to donate even after to our GoFundMe link that we'll link in the chat as well.
And this is the last logistical thing, and then we will get into the presentation, we promise. So very briefly, we wanted to just go over our community agreements, which are essentially a set of basic ground rules that we ask all of our participants to keep in mind so that we ensure that this space is a safe and inclusive one for all. I'm not going to go too much into detail because you can see them in front of you, but just remember to be respectful, use I statements when sharing, and remember that this is a learning environment. We all are here to learn, nobody knows everything. And just remember to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. Again, learning will make you uncomfortable, but that is why we're here. And it's okay to be wrong, but we are going to hold you accountable in this space. And I won't go into it anymore. So without any further ado, on to Alicia's presentation.
Thank you so much. I want to thank Harvard Albanian Student Association and Albanians Active Now for putting so much work into organizing this, publicizing this, putting it out there. This is something I'm really excited to do, so I'm glad that everyone here is here to join us today. We can go to the next one. So I wanted to start with an introduction. If anyone has more questions about kind of my background and my entry into this, feel free to ask that using the question link. But very briefly, as was mentioned, I originally was introduced to Albanian culture through a refugee family who lived in my hometown. I'm an Afro-Puerto Rican woman from Connecticut. My pronouns are she, her, ayo. And my entry into Albanian studies and my entry into the Black Lives Matter movement were something that actually kind of happened at the same time. So in 2014, the end of 2014 and the beginning of 2015, I entered as a freshman undergraduate at Wesleyan. And that was the first time I started exploring the history of Black people, of my own people, the history of our oppression. And with all of the police killings that were happening that year, I started protesting at my university. At the same time, I was studying political science and religion, and I had this like knowledge about Albanian culture that I had picked up in high school, and my professors were encouraging me to develop that into an academic interest. And a lot of my interest in Albanian culture comes from looking at similar oppressions and the similar ways that Albanians were oppressed in the Balkans and the ways that Black people were oppressed in the United States. And so that started getting me interested in both the movement and in Albanian studies more generally. One of the things that is particularly interesting to me in my studies is looking at these global connections. So I was interested in thinking about different oppressions like anti-Albanian sentiment, anti-Bosnian or Bosniak sentiment, and anti-Roma sentiment were operating in similar ways that anti-Blackness was operating in the United States. And I was also interested in like the particular differences between those different oppressions. So that's kind of how I got to this point. There's also like a lot I can say about being a Black woman who has lived, studied, worked in Kosovo and in Albania. And if y'all are interested in talking about that, feel free to ask. But let's get into the larger presentation. So I wanted to start with this video clip. It's just a brief history to contextualize anti-Black police violence in the United States.
Dr. Keisha Blaine is a historian specializing in African American history.
The early roots of American policing begin within the context of slavery. Before the Civil War, African Americans, particularly those living in the U.S. South, were enslaved. One of the things that developed throughout various parts of the South was the creation of slave patrols.
Slave patrols were made of white volunteers. They would stop, question, and punish enslaved people caught without a permit to travel. They used vigilante tactics and terror to deter slave revolts. South Carolina set up the first slave patrol in 1704.
Well, the white volunteers who joined the slave patrols felt empowered to control the lives of Black people. And this is where we begin to talk about how whiteness functions within the historical lens.
Then came the Reconstruction era after the American Civil War. It's during this time the U.S. starts seeing organized and uniformed police officers. By the end of the 19th century, all major U.S. cities had police forces in place.
They are made up of predominantly white men, and they are functioning in a very similar way as the earlier slave patrols, in that they are continually targeting Black people.
The 13th Amendment abolished slavery in the U.S. in 1865, yet Black codes were introduced immediately after. These laws controlled the lives of Black people, restricted Black people's movement, restricted Black property ownership, and punished African American men out of work under vagrancy laws.
Police forces were very much part of the story. Their job was to uphold these codes.
Jim Crow laws legalized racial segregation. Southern white supremacists systematically used lynching to terrorize African Americans. There were over 4,000 racial terror lynchings in at least 12 southern states from 1877 to 1950. White officials and police watched and rarely did anything.
By the time we get to the early 20th century, within the context of the Jim Crow South, what we see are police forces actually making it possible for white vigilantes to murder Black people, to lynch Black people, rather than arrest people for acts of violence.
The painful history of police brutality continued during the civil rights movement.
There are all these moments where, as activists are marching peacefully, they encounter local police who attack them, who beat them up, who arrest them for all kinds of minor offenses, or actually no offenses. Police forces during the civil rights era generally stood against protesters.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 ended segregation on paper, but uprisings triggered by acts of police brutality continued. From the urban uprising in the late 60s to the LA uprisings of 1992, violent policing of African Americans persisted. Then, in 2014, a police officer fatally shot 18-year-old Michael Brown in Ferguson. That galvanized the Black Lives Matter movement.
I see so many parallels even to the 1960s, and not solely the ways that people are organizing and the kinds of strategies they're employing, but even to the issue of police violence.
There have been repeated attempts to reform police departments. There were calls for all cops to wear body cameras. They didn't deliver. Officers were trained to use more non-lethal force, but the training hasn't stopped killings. Thousands of cops have been investigated for misconduct. Police violence hasn't stopped. So people are recording police brutality, and people are sharing it. And in 2020, a white police officer in Minnesota will face criminal prosecution for the death of a black civilian.
I am happy that all the officers have been arrested. My fathers have not been killed like this. We deserve justice. That's all I have to say.
It's rare for cops to ever face trial, much less conviction. The officer who knelt on George Floyd's neck had worked as a police officer for almost 2 decades. This is despite being involved in a fatal shooting of a suspect and having multiple complaints filed against him. So protesters are calling to defund the police, and some are even calling for abolition. Campaigners want massive police budgets reduced and want funds reallocated towards social services.
The movement certainly brought the issue of police violence to the national spotlight. They will talk about how activists organize on the ground, and they will talk about some of the resistance that activists faced. They'll talk about the surveillance that activists face. I think the current moment is very much a part of the larger narrative of the Black freedom struggle.
So I decided to show that video because I think it really succinctly traces the origins of the US police force. And in particular, it really points out how the development of the US police force came alongside like this anti-Blackness that started with slavery, that went into the Black codes. So you see this like simultaneous development. But I also thought it was really important to ground us in the present moment. One of the things that I find, especially when I'm working with non-Black immigrant communities, is that there's this idea of like, I came to this country as an immigrant, I had it hard, and I built myself up. How come Black people didn't do that? And I think that what this does is really contextualize the long, long history of like white supremacy and anti-Blackness that has continuously put people down in the ways it might not do to other groups. So I thought that was especially pertinent to point out. We can go to the next slide. So I wanted to parallel that with kind of some things that I explored in my own research about anti-Albanian police brutality in the Balkans. And as I'm sure most of us know, that in Kosovo, before the war really broke out, there were these protests and there was massive police brutality against Albanian protesters from the then Yugoslav state. And one of the things that I'm always interested in as a point of comparison in my research is also looking at anti-Albanian police brutality in the Balkans, which functions in a similar way. So we see, for example, Albanians in Macedonia have protested over police killings. Greek police are notorious for anti-Albanian police violence in particular. And then, of course, in Yugoslavia, in certain parts of Montenegro, in certain parts of southern Serbia, we see this police violence. And I bring this up because I think it's a really important point of convergence between the Black struggle and the Albanian struggle. And even though they're occurring in 2 different locations under 2 different historical and social circumstances, there is this connection that our communities have with state violence through the police. And I think that when we're having conversations about police violence, this is a really interesting point to bring up. So I wanted to move into this idea of race and what race is, because I find the biggest contention when trying to organize and trying to create solidarity, in particular between Albanian and generally Balkan ethnic groups and Black folks, is this idea of race, what it means, how it's defined, because this can get a little bit confusing. And so I titled this slide "Race Somewhat Defined" because the hard thing about defining race is that in every era, it is kind of manipulated and changed to mean different things. So I think in the 19th century, it was more biologically based, that this idea that certain racial groups have these genes that make them somehow inferior. But what we're seeing, I think, more and more now is more of a cultural racism, and pointing to people's culture and saying this is why they're inferior, because they have these elements within their culture. So I take I pull my definition of race from critical race theory specifically, because I think it really encompasses all of those different ways race has been thought about. So race is a socio-historical construct that first emerged through Western European colonialism and imperialism. And so basically what that means is that as these Western European countries were colonizing Africa, were colonizing Asia, were colonizing North America, they were encountering people who are not only culturally and religiously radically different from them, but also physically radically different from them. And because these countries were colonizing with particular economic and political goals, they had to find a way to deal, for lack of a better word, with the populations where they were colonizing and conceptualize those differences. And so we see this idea of race employed to almost stratify society. So, for example, with African Americans, or with Black folks, they're racialized in that way to designate them as property, to designate them as people who can be bought and sold. Whereas, for example, Indigenous people in the United States were racialized a little bit differently. They were racialized as people who needed to be eliminated, people who were in the way of land acquisition. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's important to trace those roots back to Western European colonialism and imperialism. And again, point out that it is a fluid and constantly shifting construction. We'll talk a little bit in the next slide about whiteness and how that fluidity looks. But I cannot stress enough that race can't be reduced to a biological, ethnic, or cultural category. These two things often overlap, or these things often overlap with each other, but they are not the same. Race is not about self-identification, but it's about the way one is socially perceived when navigating the world. So I think that's a really important distinction that needs to be made, really thinking about how you present to people and what that means for the way you navigate society. And I also really briefly wanted to mention this idea of racialization. It's an ideological process of attributing racial meaning to particular groups. And again, as I mentioned with the example between Black folks and Indigenous folks, people experience racism in different ways, and racism against different groups operates in different ways. But it's important to stress that this racialization process is, again, a socio-historical construct. So there's no biological significance to being Black. It's not a culture when we're talking about racialization, when we're talking about the imposing of race. It's really about, so it's a mechanism of social control, essentially, that's prescribed on certain people to categorize certain people as superior and deserving of certain rights, and others as inferior and not deserving. We can go to the next slide. So whiteness is a really huge question, and I find in particular when we're talking about Balkan ethnicities, this idea of whiteness comes up, and I've heard a lot of different things about whiteness in particular with Albanians, and there's like a pretty robust debate on like social media about whether or not Albanians are in fact white. And so I wanted to share a quote from some very important critical race theorists, Michael Omi and Howard Winant, that really encapsulates this. So particularly during the 19th century, the category of white was subject to challenges brought about by the influx of diverse groups who were not of the same Anglo-Saxon stock as the founding immigrants. In the 19th century, political and ideological struggles emerged over the classification of Southern Europeans, the Irish, and Jews among the non-white categories. Nativism was only effectively curbed by the institutionalization of a racial order that drew the color line around rather than within Europe. Now, this quote is important for a number of reasons. First, it pinpoints the origin of this idea of whiteness. And it is important to acknowledge that whiteness was not an all-encompassing thing for all European ethnicities. The idea of whiteness was originally a category that was limited to Anglo-Saxon Protestant folks. So that excluded European Catholics and a number of other immigrant groups that were coming into the United States. However, it's going back to the idea of race as something that is fluid. This category of white has expanded over time. And so when these authors say the institutionalization of a racial order that drew the color line around rather than within Europe, this is precisely what I mean. In the contemporary moment, the white category is drawn around Europe, and so European ethnicities are white. And I've had this this kind of debate with people a lot about whether or not Albanians are white, but I think a lot of that comes from trying to understand Albanian oppression in different historical moments. And I think that it's possible to understand the ways that Albanians perhaps have been racialized in the Balkans and oppressed, while also recognizing that Albanians here in North America are racialized as white, and thus are able to navigate the world as white. And that really changes the way that you approach things. I also wanted to briefly mention white supremacy and anti-Black racism, because I think these are racial projects that are most pertinent, particularly in the United States, but in North America and Western Europe more generally. And I want to frame it as the social, political, and economic dominance of those considered white at the expense of those considered Black, or sometimes those considered non-white. And so again, I really want to press this point that whiteness is something that shapes, that very strongly shapes American and North American society. And so folks who are coming from any European countries, including Albania, including Kosovo, when they come to the United States, they do have that racialization, and that makes their experience, even their specific immigrant experience, different than it would be for somebody who was racialized. We can go to the next slide. So I think this is probably the most important part of the lecture, thinking about building Black Albanian solidarity. And this is something that I've been thinking about a lot, especially on reflecting on my own experiences, not only with the Albanian diaspora here in the United States, but also in my experiences in Albania and in Kosovo. I think the first and probably most important thing is to insist on being an anti-racist community and committing to educating friends and family members. Like, I cannot stress this enough. Speaking to people who are close to you is essential if we want to really start building this movement. There's massive education that needs to go on. And I'll talk a little bit about my own work because I do run a racial justice organization in my own town. And a sizable amount of our activities are created are dedicated to, for example, reading groups and study groups, other forms of public education, because I think a lot of people really don't understand the roots of racism in this country. And that's why I started off this presentation with that video, because that is something that needs to be impressed upon people. There is this idea that Black people somehow just haven't tried hard enough and that they just need to like lift themselves up and then they'll be good. But people don't acknowledge the many different ways in this country, both institutionally and on an individual basis, all of the barriers that have stopped Black people from achieving that. And in particular, in this country with police violence, we see probably some of the most severe results of anti-Blackness and white supremacy. In the school to prison pipeline, and generally the prison industrial complex, which is disproportionately made up of Black people, we see the consequences of this. So understanding that it's not just about insults and hurt feelings, but that these things are deeply embedded in American systems and North American systems, and that they need to be dissected and the histories need to be understood to start these conversations. The second thing, which is really essential, is acknowledging the role whiteness plays in the ways Albanians navigate the world, both in Albania and Kosovo and in the West. This is something that I think people struggle with the most in this like anti-racist work, especially within the Albanian community. First, I want to address why I put the role whiteness plays in Albania and Kosovo. And this can kind of go back to the current research I'm working on, where I look at how racism is experienced by Roma, Ashkali, and Egyptian folks in Kosovo who are racially different. And I think that's something that hasn't been talked about enough. I can send this article, but there was this really great article in Kosovo 2.0 from a Roma activist talking about how he felt kind of silenced and ignored because there was a lot of support among Albanians for Black Lives Matter, but then not as much support when a lot of the Roma, Ashkali, and Egyptian communities were organizing against racism. So like also acknowledging that like whiteness goes beyond the United States, and that because of the very dominant nature of the West, that these ideas also get disseminated and translated and retranslated in a lot of different contexts. And then of course, also thinking about whiteness as it pertains to the West. And then the other point is resisting the urge to quantify or to rank oppression. And this is also one thing that I think building solidarity in general across groups, you run into this idea of, oh, I had it worse, so why are you crying? Or who has it worse? And using this ranking as a way to silence people. And I think it's particularly harmful and dangerous to go down that path. So while it is really important to find these points of convergence, for example, the ways that Albanians experience police brutality in the Balkans and the ways that Black people experience police brutality in the United States, it's also important to acknowledge differences, but those differences don't necessarily need to be quantified or ranked, but they do need to be acknowledged. And then the last piece of advice that I have is to show up to events hosted by local racial justice organizations. Donate your time, your talent, your resources. This is probably one of the most important things you can do. As somebody who is organizing on the ground, we need all of the support we can get. There are so many impediments to this kind of work. Because there's so many people who need help, but all of these organizations have limited numbers of volunteers, limited amount of money. And so if you have any money, any time, any like particular skill set that you can donate to your local organization, I really recommend doing that. Because ultimately, I truly believe that this fight for racial justice is not going to be won just through like national elections or federal elections or anything like that, but it's going to be won through on the ground organizing. And so supporting the folks in your communities who are doing this on the ground organizing is really important. All right, so thank you so much for listening to me. Feel free again to throw any questions you might have for me in the chat or in the link. And yeah, and also all of these, I attributed all of the artists' Instagrams where I found these. So if y'all are interested in following them, yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much, Alicia. We'll give people a few seconds to put questions either at the link that's at the top of the presentation screen, or if that's not working for you, directly into the chat box. And we thought an efficient way to handle questions would be to have Merita and Nora present them directly to Alicia. So Merita and Nora, do you guys want to kick off with the questions we've been collecting?
I'm sure, Merita, if you wouldn't mind kicking it off, just because I'm sharing and haven't had a chance to actually look through anything.
Yeah, so far, I think we are getting a few more coming in. So the first question that we got was, how's your experience in Kosovo in particular, if you feel comfortable sharing any experiences of racism. And I know that this is something that I just want to use this opportunity to make a plug for our second session, Hip Hop in Albania, where I know we had talked about talking with that a little bit more. But that's the first question we have here.
Yeah, so being a Black woman in Kosovo is interesting. The first time I went to Kosovo was when I was 18. It was summer 2015. I attended the American University in Kosovo for the summer. And it was also my first time ever leaving the United States. So I think that probably colored that experience as well. But I think the first thing I noticed immediately getting off the plane was just staring. People kept staring at me, and it was strange to me. And I realized that as I met people and as I talked to people, there are a lot of people who have literally never seen a Black woman in real life. Especially when I was traveling outside of like the main cities and going into like more villages, people were shocked. I think it's a little bit similar to the way I think both Black folks and blonde folks in China are perceived. People are just not used to seeing people who look like you, so there's a lot of staring. People ask for pictures, and that didn't bother me so much, but the one thing that really did bother me was street harassment. And I know that this is a larger problem in Kosovo in particular, not just for Black women, but I think as a Black woman, there's like a racial element to it. So people would like just like yell celebrities' names at me, like Black celebrities, like Beyonce, Rihanna, whatever Black celebrity kind of came to their head. People would like come up to me and touch my hair without my permission, which was something that really bothered me. And I think in general, like men would come and touch my body. And that's probably the most pertinent experiences that I had in Kosovo. I find that since 2015, the frequency is less, but it's definitely still definitely a thing. Like my experience is walking by myself as a Black woman.
Thank you for sharing that. So our next question, hold on one second. I'm going to leave this question about the family towards the end because I think we can all chime in. This next question we have is how do you negotiate between tokenization and inclusion in Albanian culture? And so the example here is Telebingo show with a Black woman who is the host. So thinking about how that might be great for inclusion, but wondering how that might also lead to tokenization by the other hosts.
Yeah, definitely. It's a difficult line to negotiate, I think. I think we'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about Albanian hip hop artists and Blackness. But yeah, the Telebingo girl, I think she's Brazilian. I mean, it is tokenization, right? And I think it comes from understanding Blackness as just an aesthetic and not as like a people with a history and a culture. And that's kind of what I see. Like a lot of these, I guess like the Telebingo girl, for example, might be in her position because there's this like weird exotic aesthetic interest in tokenizing her. But I would suspect that there's little understanding of like what it means to be a Black Brazilian woman and like what that culture is and what struggles that they have to face. And I think that's really where the disconnect goes when people think that you can just dress up as a Black person and that's all that Blackness is.
Yeah, I think this also ties in well to this next question because I think there's a lot of misinformation and education that like can lead to that tokenization and some of the more negative sides of that. So the next question is, are there any resources available for us that we can access to learn more about the history of race and racism in the US? Books, articles, podcasts that come to mind. I do, before I turn it over, I'm gonna put in the chat an article that Hannah and I wrote, which does have some links at the end too, specifically around abolition. So if you're interested in exploring that concept, but I'm sure there are plenty. So I would also encourage other people on this call to put suggestions in the chat while Alicia offers ones that have been helpful, maybe that you found in your studies.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely recommend The New Jim Crow. I feel like that's an essential text, not only to understand race in America, but the particularities of like police violence and like the prison industrial complex. So I feel like The New Jim Crow is probably an essential one. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I could make a whole list. So maybe we can send an email out or something. But if you read anything, I would read The New Jim Crow.
I like that. There's actually also a book called The New Jim Code, I think, that reminds me of, which is fascinating. I really like to geek out about tech and surveillance, and it talks about how racist our algorithms, even on social media, are. So I think that because the question is so broad around race and racism, I would really encourage people to think about what aspect of it you're interested in, because it touches everything, especially if you are based in the US or North America on this call. Really, you can look at anything through the lens of race and racism. So depending on what in particular you're interested in, there can be different recommendations.
All right, so one of the other questions that came in from Anonymous asks that they would argue that Albanians in the US have embraced whiteness. Would you agree with this? And how do you approach this?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think it really depends on which Albanian communities you're looking at, because I know that a lot of the Albanians that I grew up with in my area predominantly lived in poor Black and brown neighborhoods. And so it's kind of a different dynamic, but I also know Albanians who are pretty affluent and have integrated into whiteness. So I guess it's not a matter of whether Albanian Americans have accepted whiteness or not, but like the very fact that they have the option to, I think is important to underscore. Because not everybody has the option to integrate into whiteness. So I think that is a particular privilege of whiteness. But I think in terms of actually accepting whiteness, it varies. One of the particular ways that whiteness operates in the United States towards white immigrants is kind of absorbing or almost masking ethnic culture for kind of this larger American culture, American white culture. So I feel like that's probably one of the characteristics of that process, but I wouldn't say all Albanian Americans have accepted whiteness.
So next question I thought was actually kind of interesting, and I don't know if you want to go too much into detail about it now, but how would you respond to an Albanian that says, but I'm not white? Because I feel like we do hear this often. Like you've mentioned that a lot of Albanians will like identify with a certain part of being Albanian especially. So what would you say would be a good response to something like that?
And I would just add, if we want to combine that with this question that just came in around Albanians that may use racist slurs, especially the more elderly, for Romas and Ashkalis. And the question earlier around like, how do we have this conversation with our families, which I would plug in the third session because the entire time we'll be brainstorming together on that. But anyways, just wanted to blend in a couple of the ones that are coming in.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, you can't change anyone's mind, right? But what I would say is I would encourage them to stop thinking about race as a self-identity. Because I think part of the reason why Albanians reject whiteness is because it's seen as, for some folks, embracing whiteness is seen as rejecting Albanianness. And for a lot of folks, they feel like Albanian culture is more similar to a lot of African and Asian cultures than it is to white American European culture. And I think that that's where this tendency to reject it comes from. And I think there's also this tendency to assume that because Albanians have experienced a huge amount of oppression, especially historically, that precludes them from whiteness. And that's also kind of a myth. That does not preclude them from whiteness, but it also, acknowledging one's whiteness does not negate any of the struggles that Albanians have faced. And I think that's another issue that kind of comes up when people very adamantly insist that they're not white, they're Albanian. And then what, Marita, I think you had another piece to that. How do we talk to our families and like thinking about the use of slurs? Yeah, I mean, when I'm in Kosovo, I definitely hear a lot of Albanians using slurs against Roma people. And it's interesting because I often sit down with my Roma friends in Kosovo, and when we talk about similar things. We talk about these experiences with racial slurs and these comments and these microaggressions. So there are also a lot of parallels, I feel like, between those two experiences. But I guess, is the question, how do you respond to like relatives who are saying slurs? I mean, I think the most important thing is to say something, because it's very possible that that term is so normalized that they don't even see it as an insult. So making it clear that like, that's an offensive term, and when you say it in front of me, I'm gonna mention that it's an offensive term, I think is a really good first step to addressing that.
Just a heads up, when you do that, you get called overly sensitive a lot. So personal experience, guys. I guess next question, there's two questions that I think can kind of be woven in, and it's sort of like, do you think Albanians have a more unique perspective on like police brutality or like state oppression because of their historic experiences? And do you see similarities? I guess you kind of covered this maybe a bit in the lecture, but I guess if you could maybe elaborate a bit more on like those similarities, and then how do they play out, especially with Albanians who have moved to North America?
Yeah, I can definitely talk about that. I mean, so one of the things that you see, I believe, in like probably after 1912, so in like the early to mid 20th century, you see these biological justifications, primarily from Serbian nationalists, to explain Albanian inferiority. So there's this idea that Albanians came from monkeys and that they had tails. And these types of characterizations of biological racisms are something that Black folks also experienced. And I think when you trace that history, and then you go to the 90s, where you saw Albanians peacefully protesting against conditions in Kosovo, and you see this massive police repression that's also coupled with a sort of cultural oppression. So this idea that Albanians couldn't have their own schools, I think it's very similar, this idea that state violence is a means to almost assimilate folks or homogenize a nation in different ways. But I think like in particular, because Black folks are marked like physically as different, that definitely complicates that comparison. But in particular, just looking at the history of the 90s with state violence, I think one of the really interesting things about that is that in probably like 89 or 90, you see the rise of these Albanian rappers in Kosovo who are rapping about police brutality in the same way that we see Black Americans in the Bronx, where hip hop originated, rapping about police brutality and the struggles of police brutality. So these experiences with state oppression, I think, are very similar.
I think I just want to jump in and maybe ask a question, because this is reminding me of the webinar and teach-in we had last month, where you also compared and contrasted the differences in the liberation movements. And I really love that point that you made last time, because I think that that changes the discourse that we're seeing here compared to what we saw. So it relates to what you're talking about with state violence. So I wanted to ask you to expand on that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the other thing that's a really important point of comparison is looking at the Albanian liberation movement in Kosovo and looking at the Black liberation movement in the United States. And obviously in Kosovo, you see the intervention of these major Western powers, the United States, through NATO, and eventually Albanians in Kosovo were able to obtain, however imperfect, their own nation state. But when you look at Black folks, because our oppressor is the United States can't intervene for us because they are the ones actively doing the oppression. And so it's really interesting to think about that as well. The ways that on one hand, the United States is seen as a liberator for a lot of Kosovar-Albanians, but for a lot of Black Americans, it is the very same apparatus that is doing the oppressing. And so kind of thinking about being able to have a liberation movement and being able to solicit support from Western countries. When you are a racialized minority within Western countries, it's much harder to get that outside support.
All right, we'll wrap it up with the last question. So this one just came in and it asks, do you think empathy, so talking about the mistreatment of Albanians in the Balkans, is a good way to get Albanians to understand anti-Black racism?
I think it's an important first step, but I think it can't be the only step. And that's because if you just say, oh, look, Albanians experienced oppression, police oppression, just like Black people, you run the risk of reducing struggles and through that comparison. So I think it's a really good point of departure to say, like, look at this history of police oppression against Albanians. We know what it's like, and so we have to stand in solidarity with other groups who are experiencing this oppression. But then taking it a step further and recognizing that as Albanians, we are also white, and we also have a number of privileges being particularly Albanians in North America, I think. And we have to acknowledge that, and we have to acknowledge the very long history of anti-Blackness in this country to truly understand why Black people are protesting, why Black people are calling for change in this country.
Well, thank you for your answers. For those of you who maybe have thought of something or will think of something afterwards, as always happens, Alicia is on social media, so I'm sure you'd be happy to take some cool, well-worded questions.
Yes.
So on the next slide here, we'll have more details. I'll just move on and we will wrap things up.
Yeah, just want to emphasize again to please consider donating to the National Black Justice Coalition if you can. And we'll plug in the donation link in the chat as well. And just remember that this can be a good first step in order to kind of engage in some intersectional activism and support these organizations that are doing really, really important work. Yeah, and also join us for parts 2 and 3 of our series on October 4th and 18th. Part 2 is covering Albanian hip hop culture and should be really interesting to see the ways in which Black culture is interpreted in Albania. And part 3 to provide a space to have these really important discussions of how we talk to our families, how we talk to our parents about engaging in anti-racism in our day-to-day lives. And we will also have the registration link for that in our chat.
And I would also plug, so I just put the registration link in there. If you really enjoyed this session, I'd encourage you to share the link, the recording afterwards. We'll email it to you, but also to bring a friend. If you're planning on coming to part 2 or part 3, which it sounded like a lot of people had questions that would really be great at part 3, where we are having the conversation together and figuring this all out together. Please bring a friend or two to the next session.
Yes, and the next session, like we said, covers Albanian hip hop culture. I am personally very excited about this session. We're going to be talking about our problematic faves and explaining why they're problematic and why this is something that we should care about, like why our appropriation and abuse of Black culture is a problem. We are going to be going through music videos. It's going to be, I think, really educational and also a lot of fun. Um, I think we've covered the last few things that we wanted to cover. If you're able to donate to support the National Black Justice Coalition, please do so. We will be posting a recording of this session. And we do ask that you share it widely, especially if you know of people who wanted to attend but couldn't. Please share it widely. Register for our next event. I think that all of the links are posted there for registering at the next event. And thank you to Alicia for putting together this presentation. Thank you for the time that you spent answering the questions. There were some really good questions in here. Thank you so much for coming up with these great discussion points that we hadn't thought of. We will stick around a little bit longer in case you guys want to chat with us. I think that we can probably unmute the participants now. We'll stick around for a little bit longer, but this concludes our agenda for today. Thanks so much for taking time out of your Sunday to spend it with us having this conversation. And I really
all the socials, by the way, they're all listed there. We
yes, check
of new
yes
follows and likes and retweets. Excuse me.
Yes, please check all of our social media links below. Thanks, Nora, for the reminder. But yeah, if you guys want to stick around, feel free. But this concludes the event for today. Enjoy your Sunday, everybody.